I'm Jay Moran.
I'm Bridget Jaipal Valenza.
I'm Thomas O'Neill White.
We need to get together and let our voices be heard.
This is What's Next, a dedicated hour to have important conversations about the issues facing the marginalized and underrepresented communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario.
If we're going to have some real healing, we've got to have space to tell some uncomfortable truth.
What's Next continues our mission to discuss race,
Equity,
and the common concerns of Buffalo's East Side and beyond.
In the suburban area, everywhere, we must work and teach our children.
You're listening to What's Next. I'm host Thomas O'Neill White, and joining me today is a very special guest, especially for us history nerds, New City of Buffalo historian and Niagara Aerospace Museum Executive Director, Lindsey Lauren Visser. Lindsey, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be here, and I love any excuse to talk about history.
Awesome. So you're the first City of Buffalo historian since when?
So to the best of my knowledge, 1979. And it's interesting because I think one of the first challenges of being city historian was, could I identify the last city historian? Because if I couldn't find it, nobody else was going to. So I did some digging and I did some research, and to the best of my knowledge, it was Walter Dunn, who was the former executive director of the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society. And when he stepped down in 1979, the position was never refilled.
So on your website, you say you didn't fully appreciate the city of Buffalo until you moved back. Why was that? And what about your travels made you come around to a fuller appreciation of this fair city?
I think for everybody who lives here, you're just used to, in some respects, some of the stories, some of the history, which I might add is really only scratching the surface in so many respects. But you kind of think every city must have history that's like this, right? Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until I left and had the opportunity to kind of experience something a little bit different that I came back and went, whoa, hang on a second. Buffalo is so important to so many moments in our state and our national and our international history. So it was such a natural thing for me as a historian to come back and say, hey, wait a minute. These are stories that need to be told. I love telling them. And I just kind of gravitated toward it, and I haven't looked back since.
You specialized in European history at Canisius University, while also, Canisius College at the time.
Thank you. Yeah, it's still so jarring to me, but good for them. I'm proud of them. So,
specialized in European history at Canisius while majoring in political science. And you had plans of becoming a history professor.
I did, and I thought that was the thing that you did when you studied history. It just felt like the natural move. But one of the things that I love most about Canisius College or University is that it's a Jesuit institution. And so one of the big things that they encouraged was taking a year break in between advanced study and doing a year service. So I did a year service with the AmeriCorps, and that experience completely changed everything for me. So I taught social studies in a Buffalo public school to middle schoolers, most of whom were classified as economically disadvantaged. And so seeing firsthand what social studies education was like in the classroom and seeing that there was this interest and this desire to learn more, but just not enough resources, not enough time, and really just that constant conflict of how do we teach this subject in a way that keeps kids engaged while balancing all of the other commitments of being a teacher. And so I finished my year of service with my head spinning a little bit, still planning on becoming a professor, went and did my master's. And my heart wasn't in it anymore, because the more that I got into this niche topic in British history, the more I realized only a handful of people were ever going to hear about it or care about it. Mm-hmm. And there are so many people who really are lacking in the most foundational knowledge of history. And I think our world is hurting for that fact. So trying to find ways to make social studies more accessible to more people kind of became the main focus of my career and my life.
And you did graduate you did graduate studies at Oxford. Kind of a big deal.
I'm told.
Well, where you researched the intellectual origins of the Act of Supremacy for fans of the Tudors, or not fans of the Tudors. Can you explain what that is?
It just warms my heart so much that we're talking about this, because I feel like I really have not touched it since I wrote my dissertation. Yes. So my undergraduate degree was political science and history. And the time period in the 1530s in England, when Henry VIII is looking for a divorce and forms the Church of England, is such an interesting confluence of religion, politics, and history. And from me looking at how do you legislate religious reform, how do you explain that, how do you sell that to the people? And so I found this compendium document. It's the Collectanea Satis Copiosa, which literally in Latin translates to sufficiently abundant argument. And it is truly all of the intellectual origins. I could get so nerdy and tell you so many cool stories about that. I won't, but it's this really interesting backstory to how the English Reformation takes place. And what I find so interesting about this poor document, it's a handwritten manuscript, first and foremost, which, again, we take for granted. Handwriting now, very different than handwriting in 1530. Also, it's written in Latin, so, more obstacles.
Well, real quick, how is it different, like handwriting?
So there's a completely different style. Like, the letters are designed and look different, right?
Okay.
So first and foremost, you have to identify what the symbol literally is. So C's look like modern day R's. That's just the way that they were shaped. And because they're handwriting and transcribing, the most annoying thing they would do is drop syllables of words and replace them with a symbol to signify they've dropped a syllable.
Oh, wow.
And so when you're reading Latin with characters that you're like, I don't even know what this is. And so now you can start to see why when we were talking about this earlier, I said, everybody who has worked with this document has left the field entirely. It's just that kind of experience. So you can kind of see why that's the case. It is really an inaccessible text. However, it's very important to the English Reformation. And so I enjoyed working on it, but at the same time, I just remember sitting there thinking to myself, I could maybe change the timeline of the English Reformation by 2 or 3 years and suggest that Henry was pursuing a break with Rome earlier than we previously thought. All 5 people who care are going to be thrilled. But beyond that, at the end of the day, my mother, who has read every paper that I've ever written, still thinks Henry had 8 wives. So I don't even know why I'm bothering. He had 6, to be clear. But I think there's so many things that people just need the foundations of, that not to knock anybody who's doing that super important niche research that really does help academics understand things more clearly. It is so critically important. But there also need to be people who are on the ground making those things more accessible to the masses. And I felt like that was a better fit for my skill set.
So it wasn't just Anne Boleyn's fault.
It's not. She gets such a bad rap, truly.
She really does.
Yeah. It's funny. I was actually just watching a documentary about her, because even though I'm focused a lot on Buffalo history, and that's where my heart is now, every once in a while you just need a little fix of the British history. And they just did her dirty. And I was like, come on, guys, do better. Read my research.
Talk a little bit about pouring into like different archives.
I love doing that. And I've been very lucky to work in quite a few very, very special ones. When I was in England, the document I was just describing was at the British Library. So being able to go in and look at the microfilms of this document that is 500 plus years old is, I mean, the number of times I'd have to sit there and remind myself I'm looking at a document that's older than my country. Also, you can go to Britain and find graffiti that's older than America, which is just crazy. But more recently, because my heart is in Buffalo history, and I'm currently working on a book on Theodore Roosevelt taking over the presidency and how that changes the course of American history and really sets the stage for the American century. I was just in the Library of Congress, and it was so much fun. Being able to be there and be in that manuscript room. I think one of the most surreal moments for me as a historian, especially studying this time period, I had no idea I'd even be allowed to call this up, but every once in a while they're like, you actually have the credentials. You're allowed to do whatever you want, which blows me away. They let me hold the items that were in McKinley's pockets when he was assassinated.
Whoa.
And I was just, again, right?
What do you have?
So he had a couple notes in his pocket, which was just like, you get chills sitting there holding these things and being like, oh my God, like this was in his pocket. It's just surreal. So he had a couple notes, a couple things that he kind of needed to take care of later in the day, and some of the physical items were in a different area. So I had the paper items, but it's just so amazing to me. All of the people, all of the historians who came before us, who had the presence of mind to know these things are so important. Not only do we need to keep them, we need to keep them in places where future generations can have access to them and utilize them and appreciate them. And so I'm always, as a historian, so appreciative to the archivists and all of the people who work in collections, because they are doing the Lord's work out there.
I heard a rumor, and please dispel this rumor if it's untrue. I heard a rumor that one of the notes in McKinley's pocket was, Josh Allen will be the future of this city.
That's actually what the bullet went right through, actually. It's a little damaged, but, you know. Yeah.
Favorite subject within the realm of European history, that would be Henry VIII.
Yeah, I really do love Tudor history. I think it's just so fascinating, again, looking at it from the political and historical positions, the combination of the two things. It really just, for my nerdy brain, was like, this is legislative history. I love it. So that was really exciting. But I also think one of the upsides to that time period was it was a slightly more accessible subject because so many people knew Henry VIII.
Right.
Whereas if I started getting really nerdy about like Henry VII and his ability to collect taxes, which truly he was great at, eyes just glaze right over. But at least with Henry VIII, there was a little bit of we're interested in this. So.
Right. The history with a little bit of scandal, people are all about.
Gravitate toward that. Yeah. So I really liked that. But then, you know, as I've shifted focus a little bit, I ended up in the time period locally that, had you told me at 16 this would be what I would be specializing in, I would have scoffed so hard. Because at 16, I knew two things absolutely. First, local historians were the most boring people. And second, the Progressive era was the most boring time period. Let me introduce myself as a local historian of the Progressive era. Oh, how the tables have turned. So that's kind of the time period that I've fallen in love with more recently, which is the 1880 to 1920 locally. So,
and why that period?
That really is Buffalo's peak time. Buffalo, at the turn of the previous century, was the 8th largest city in the country. And its history and its significance, whether it was the people who were living here or people who were from here out in the world doing things, Buffalo was on the front lines of making history in so many different ways. And it's, I think, one of the most important informative time periods in our city's history, and really does set the tone for everything that followed and led us to today.
And we were talking off air, you mentioned that the history of women in this area, in not just Buffalo but Western New York, is very prominent, very important.
That is definitely an area I have a very pronounced soft spot for, because I really truly believe the women of Western New York are just something exceptional. And even zooming out a little bit, New York State, we truly do have, I think, one of the best claims to women's history nationally. Just, it's incredible. But especially during this time period, that 1880 to 1920 period, there are women doing amazing things. Belva Lockwood is always one of the ones I love to talk about, because not only is she the first woman to legally run for the presidency, she's also the first woman admitted to the Supreme Court bar. She's the first woman to try a case in front of the Supreme Court. And as if that weren't incredible enough, she also turned around and said, great, now that I'm allowed, I'm going to make sure everybody else is too. And so she lobbied to ensure that African Americans could practice, and she personally sponsored the first African American to try a case before the Supreme Court. Incredible woman. What I love in particular is that when she ran for president, she ran against Buffalo's own Grover Cleveland, because
Incredible.
Buffalo's everywhere at this time period. We also have our nation's first daycare, Mariah Love. We have the first Congresswoman to introduce equal pay for equal work legislation at the federal level. We have women who were, so instrumental in social issues too. Mary Talbert was formative in the Niagara movement, which was the precursor to the NAACP. We have just women doing amazing things. And then when we zoom out to the state level, you have the first female vice presidential candidate. You have Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman to run for the presidency. You have Hillary Clinton, who is the junior senator of New York State, running as the first female candidate on a major party ticket. Our current first female governor is from Western New York. So, we have just this tremendous, tremendous legacy of women just blazing trails and just breaking through all obstacles in their way.
I can hear it in your voice. This is what you're passionate about.
I love it. And how can I not be? It's such a gift to have such a rich history to draw from. It'd be one thing if I were trying to convince you of the historical significance with names you've never heard of. But
right.
My goodness, when I start saying these things, they're accomplishments that have value beyond Buffalo. They changed our world in some respects. And to say they're from here, it's the coolest thing in the world.
How do we make history fun, for lack of a better term? History is fun for me. Listen, if you want to talk about the Caesar and Pompey Civil War, the Second Triumvirate, all that stuff, I'm 100% in. But for people who are not, historically inclined, you worked as a teacher, you wanted to be a professor at one point. How do we make it fun for those students who aren't really inclined towards it?
That is such a good point, and something that is really a major focus for me. I think when we teach history in the classrooms, it is still very dependent on names and dates and just handing over a document and saying, read this and interpret it, right?
Yeah, just past the Ides of March.
Right, right? Oh my gosh, so many historical moments here. So little time. So when we approach the subject in the classroom, I think the first thing is we need to rethink how it's presented to students. I would love to see some of the energy that we've seen in the STEM subjects translated over into history, making it more hands-on, making it more exploratory, having the students get more involved in their own learning process, and making it more engaging and interactive and fun. And that is so much easier said than done. But I think there are a lot of ways that we can really try to provide teachers with the resources to be able to do that. Because I think when we say make social studies more fun, teachers are doing everything already, right? Like they are doing everything in their power. So how can we, as historians, as people in museums, help support that process? Because we are people who love the content, and we will 100% provide you with all the materials you need. Just tell us how you need them, right? So I think there's a lot of connection that we can try to establish, even more so with the schools, and trying to make it a little bit more engaging. But in particular, kind of housed under social studies is civics education. And that is something that I am so passionate about, and something that I think our world and our nation especially really, really needs to take a long, hard look at and say, I think we can do better. Because our students are graduating and they're not necessarily appreciating the importance of being part of our democracy. What does that entail? Our voter turnout rates, especially in New York State, for that 18 to 24 demographic, they're low, and they're even lower in off-year elections, which is so frustrating because those off years are often the elections that matter the most in your life. They're the local officials, right? Having students understand who is actually making the laws that affect you the most, right? I think there's this perception that, well, the president is the most important position that we can vote for. In New York State, governor's more important in terms of your city, your mayor, your county executive. They are way more important races for your everyday life.
Right.
How do we get kids to realize that and become voters and become engaged in that process. So those are just some of the things that keep me up at night. But, we're working on it, trying to come up with better ways to deal with it.
Take us through the process of becoming the City of Buffalo historian, first since 1979.
I think having the background in political science came in very handy because it involved a lot of lobbying, which I was not expecting. So Doug Kohler is the county historian, and he has been doing great work since he took on the position. And in fact, he's the first county historian in that almost exact same time period gap, because they consolidated the historian positions for the city and the county. And then when they were vacant, they just never refilled either. County got filled first. He was doing great work. There are so many historians for the municipalities within Erie County. And when we were celebrating the bicentennial, one of the most pronounced absences was the fact that the city of Buffalo did not have a historian. And that seemed like a fairly tremendous oversight.
Pretty glaring omission.
Right. Kind of the heart of a lot of the history, right? And so it was a process of trying to figure out, okay, who do we reach out to try to put this on somebody's radar? Because it had been such a long time. Nobody really knew even what the process was. So I took a scattershot approach where I just went to everyone. And I started talking to the common council. I started talking to people in the mayor's office. I was talking to anybody who had anybody's ear. And as former Deputy Mayor Crystal Rodriguez Dabney likes to tell the story, there was this moment when Emerson Barr ended up coming in and saying, the Common Council has this idea to appoint a city historian. They already have a candidate. She's great. She's very well qualified. And Crystal laughs because she's like, I also have a candidate. I mean, I think mine's great. She's really well qualified too. Who's yours? And they're like, Lindsey Lauren Visser. She laughs. She's like, that's mine too. And so by the time I get to the mayor's office for the meeting, there's a stack of papers on the table in front of him. And he's like, do you realize what these are? And I was like, no. He said, these are all of the letters, just the letters that I have received about appointing you as historian. That's not even counting the phone calls. He's like, what did you do? And I just thought, you know what? Like, since nobody really knows the procedure here, let's get everybody on the same page. And so I think by the time the announcement actually came out, there were plenty of people who were just like, okay, great. She's been, wait, was it she historian? I don't know. Like it had gotten to a point where I think I had just become so intrinsically linked to this position that it was just such a natural thing. And so many people were just like, okay, good. Glad that that's sorted out. But like, okay. So it was great too, because I think one of the things that really did help in terms of navigating that system and knowing how to navigate that system, as a municipal historian, you do kind of have to balance the interests of the city and the government, and also understanding how to work within the networks that exist. And so I think that experience of figuring out, okay, how to even get the position and how to get the support that I need is going to be very helpful in terms of getting the support from now other parties to have the resources to celebrate history in Buffalo and to really do a lot with this position. So I definitely think there's two distinct sides to the role, and obtaining the position really relied upon that one municipal side.
What are 3 things you hope to accomplish as the historian for the city?
Great question. I think the first is there are so many wonderful historical organizations throughout the city of Buffalo. They are doing amazing, amazing work. Some of them are entirely volunteer run, and it can be hard to continue to have an up-to-date network of who is in charge of all of these organizations. So I think the first thing is taking stock of everybody who is doing this great work and finding opportunities to connect them more closely together, because our history, even though each of these organizations has carved out their piece of it, our story transcends individual locations. There's all sorts of points of connection. The people who are involved in telling these stories were multifaceted. So there's different parts of their lives that touch upon different museums or historical sites or agencies. And finding a way to connect these groups so that they can combine their resources and do more when there are so few resources sometimes for historical organizations, right? So how do we maximize what we have? How do we use this position as historian to highlight the good work that all of these organizations are doing, to get people more excited about it and to get people looking for them? I mean, when you think about it, you're not going to think, oh, you know what, I'm going to go to the Transportation Museum if you don't even know that there's a transportation story in Buffalo to be told, right? So it's really important, I think, to get people thinking about the history, because that will naturally lead people to the places where the history is kept. So that's my first mission, is to really, get a little bit more hands-on in the historical community. Obviously, the second is the schools. As I said before, really finding ways to make social studies education more engaging, more exciting, more hands-on, and more locally focused. There's so many great stories to tell, and stories that tie into that curriculum, that framework that tells the national story. There are things that are happening in Buffalo, and we have more content knowledge and more depth than I think we're really utilizing at this moment. So working, like I said, to support the teachers who are doing great things already, let's try to lift them up as best we can. The last is, I think, in some respects, the most pressing, because it is upon us, whether we're ready or not. We are entering in a decade of historical milestones. It's like a unique confluence.
Yeah, talk about it.
Yeah, there's so many. So next year, we're going to be celebrating the bicentennial of the Erie Canal. So 200 years, obviously being the terminus of the canal, totally changed Buffalo forever. Then in 2026, we mark the semi-quincentennial of the United States. That's the fancy way of saying our 250th anniversary of signing the Declaration of Independence. And 2027 will mark the 200th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in New York State. So those three are boom, boom, boom.
Mm-hmm.
And then shortly thereafter, which feels like a long time now, but I promise it will not be, 2032 will be the bicentennial of the city of Buffalo when it was incorporated. So it is a power-packed, we've got a lot to look forward to, a lot to talk about, and these are great opportunities to have conversations about the things that happened, some of which may be difficult conversations, but there are things that need to be talked about. There are things that need to be explored, and I think we will be better for having had this opportunity to focus on our history.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention, I mentioned earlier, but I'm going to mention again, you are also the executive director of the Niagara Aerospace Museum. Talk about a little bit about your work there.
Yes, I actually started fairly recently, and I will say coming in 5 weeks before a once-in-a-lifetime event has been quite the challenge, but our main focus is the solar eclipse, and it is truly overshadowing everything else at the moment. But we have so many really cool things planned. We are actually one of NASA's sunspots for the eclipse. So we are partnering with NASA. We're one of 8 locations in Niagara Falls where the NASA researchers and subject matter experts will be coming in to do presentations.
Wow.
I think I'm allowed to say, because this isn't airing till next week, but we're announcing this afternoon that NASA's bringing moon rocks. We're going to have an astronaut from the Canadian equivalent of NASA stopping by. So we're going to have a lot of really cool things going on. And that is April 4th through the 7th. So you can check our website for all of the information about the events and register. They're all free. So you just got to pre-register because we don't have infinite space. And then on the actual day of the eclipse, we're closed just because we are located in the Niagara Falls Airport and you cannot get out on the runways. That's like a legitimate TSA issue. Yes. So we're not encouraging people to try to upset the airport. But we will be open on Tuesday for anybody who is traveling to Niagara Falls and staying over. I think one of the big things that everybody from the municipal standpoint up in Niagara Falls was suggesting was plan on staying late if you can. So I think a lot of people are staying over on Monday night. So if you're still in the area on Tuesday, we will be open with more events and programs on Tuesday as well.
What's your favorite obscure history fact?
There's so many good ones. And I thought of another one.
A few favorites.
I think I'm going to need a couple here.
Yes.
Okay, so my first one, as I had mentioned earlier, is Mad Jack Churchill, who is this absolutely incredible figure in obscure history. He has the last confirmed wartime kill with a longbow. And it was during World War II. Yes. So there's this phenomenal picture of him landing on the beaches in Normandy for D-Day with his longbow. So the whole thing, the whole image of it truly is just one of those moments where you sit there and you think to yourself, wow, how did we get here? Mm-hmm. So that's one of my favorites. Another one is, and there's so much history about, in particular, presidential assassinations and inaugurations, and that has become one of my kind of specialties for being a location of a presidential assassination and a inauguration. But Buffalo is one of only 4 locations in our nation to host a presidential inauguration outside of the Capitol. And it's interesting because only 2 of those 4 are legally binding. So Theodore Roosevelt's oath of office that he takes at 641 Delaware and Lyndon Johnson's oath of office that he takes at Love Field on Air Force One are the only 2 legally binding inaugurations. That is it. That's all they do for their entire first terms. And so Theodore Roosevelt has a second inauguration when he wins his second term, as does Lyndon Johnson. But for the entirety of the first term that they serve, that's it. The oath that he took in Buffalo, that's it.
Wow.
Yes.
What were the 2 other non-legally binding ones? So
Calvin Coolidge took the oath of office, and his father, who was a justice of the peace, actually administered the oath of office to him. So it's kind of silly. The Constitution has really only 2 requirements to take the oath of office. It requires a federal magistrate, and it requires the saying of the oath. Mm-hmm. So it's a very low threshold, and yet somehow they weren't even able to meet it twice. I'm shocked by this. But so Calvin Coolidge is one, and Chester Arthur was given the oath in New York City in his apartment following the assassination of James Garfield. And again, it was not a federal magistrate who administered the oath of office, and therefore he had to take it when he returned to D.C. So we happened to have one. Judge John R. Hazel administered the oath. And actually, for Johnson, it was Sarah T. Hughes. It's the only time a woman has administered the presidential oath of office.
Wow.
Yeah. And I did think of another one that is one of my favorites. So when we think of something called preemptive self-defense, which is in international law, pretty much the only way that a country can legally declare war. It's codified in Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations. And I know you're kind of like, okay, where's she going with this? I promise it's relevant. This very, very critically important piece that was actually used to justify going to war against the threat of ISIS, weapons of mass destruction,
yes,
all of these major things in our recent history, is because of an event that happened on Lake Erie in 1837.
What?
I know! Yeah. Yes. So it's codified in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. It is the litmus test. It's called the Caroline test.
Okay.
And it is based on a boat that was set on fire in 1837 in Lake Erie, pushed over Niagara Falls. And it ended up changing international law forever, to the point where we're still, literally as recently as 2016, in the British Parliament asking, did you fully apply the Caroline principles to your decision to go to war against ISIS?
Wow.
Yeah.
My mind is blown. Well, my mind has been this whole conversation. I'm just learning and learning. This is fantastic.
Yeah.
What is something you want the next city historian to take from your tenure? How long is your tenure? Is it a year? Do you get to renew? Or?
So my understanding is it's initially a 1-year appointment and it can be renewed. But I think it's only been a week. But I think my hope, at least, is one of the things that I've really tried to approach this position and being a historian in general. My big concern, and the main way I've approached it, is thinking that we're in the middle of a story. That the past is not this isolated thing that's so far removed from us. It really is so relevant to our present in so many ways. And so when we talk about our history, it's so important to me that we find ways to connect it to the present and make it very clear that this is going to be relevant for our future. It's so easy to get lost in those wonderful archives and start talking about the historical details and get so excited about it. But if we can't find a way to make it accessible and connect it to the present and make it clear how it's relevant to our future, we are missing out on one of, I think, the most important and powerful pieces of history. It's that it's ongoing, right? We have the ability to keep writing it and keep changing the course of our future. And the better information we have, the better our understanding of the past, I think the better our future can be. So I do hope that any subsequent historians really take to heart the idea that while this is a position that is designed to work on our history, it has a very important role in our modern world and in helping to provide the tools for our future. So that's my hope. It's a heavy ask. We'll see how I do with it before I wish it on somebody else. But
And are you the first woman historian in the city of Buffalo? So you are making history.
It is so strange to become the thing that you study. So I'm not complaining. But it was just a very surreal moment to have the announcement during Women's History Month, standing in the mayor's office, just surrounded by all of these people. It was a little unfortunate because, from my perspective, of course, I'm very mindful of these things, but immediately behind the backdrop that has the seal of the city of Buffalo is like Grover Cleveland's portrait from when he was mayor of Buffalo. And I'm just like, this is just so surreal to be standing here right now and being asked to tell all of these stories.
Yeah.
And there are so many to tell, and I will be the first to say it is almost impossible to be an expert in everything in Buffalo history. There's just too much, truly. And so my hope with the position is to be a platform for the people who are working on each of these different subjects and really making tremendous advances in our understanding, and give them the opportunity to talk about this. Because while I love a certain specific time period, I know there's so much to that story, and I cannot possibly do justice to all of it. This is a team effort in so many respects, and so I'm just kind of looking at this as, okay, I'm going to be the coordinator of who's up and who's going to be taking the lead on certain things, but it's just such an incredible moment, I think, in our city's history to say, you know what, we are going to invest in arts and history, and having the Poet Laureate announcement at the same time, I think was just really wonderful to say, this is something that matters to our people, and we're going to bring people in to make sure that we're providing it with the time and resources it needs to really excel. Yeah,
shout out to Itina Farid Cook, who we had on last week. That was a really lovely ceremony that the two of you had at the mayor's office.
Yeah, and we actually had not had much opportunity to work together before the announcement. But even since, talking more about what she does, what I do, we're already thinking of how can we combine her skill set, my skill set, how can we maybe reapproach even how we're telling the history? Because what she does is so amazing and different, and we really haven't tried telling history in different mediums, wrapping it, making poems about it, doing something that I think might resonate with people and create and reconnect that emotional human element to history. Because I think that's one of the things that I really fight against, is it can be so clinical and detached when we present it.
Yes.
So how do you make people appreciate that history is made by people with all of their complexity, with all of their flaws, with all of their human foibles that you and I have today? How do we put the human element back in it? And I think that's something that poetry can do in a way that sometimes historians can't, because it is so universal to be able to feel those things and evoke emotions. So we're trying to find ways to be a little different and avant-garde in how we approach history and poetry.
And we are making history right here, the WBFO Digital Studios. You're listening to What's Next. I want to thank my guest, City of Buffalo historian and Niagara Aerospace Museum Executive Director Lindsey Lauren Visser, for joining us today. This is What's Next on WBFO News. We'll be back with more after this.
Hi, I'm Christina. I love exploring the world around me, and I have behind-the-scenes VIP tickets to some of the most exciting places and people in Western New York. And you can come along with me from wherever you are. Let's go! A new series you can watch on WNED PBS, the Buffalo Toronto Public Media YouTube channel, and on PBS Learning Media nationwide.
So let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go.
You're listening to What's Next our place to discuss the important issues of our communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario. We want to hear from you. Click on the Talk to Us option in the WBFO app, and we will work to get your questions or comments on the air. Do you have a story or concern that we should be addressing? Email us using whatsnext@wbfo.org. Together we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
This is What's Next, and we are joined by Gittel Evangelist, the communications coordinator for Rural and Migrant Ministry. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for having me.
So I think maybe a good place to start is we can talk a little bit about Rural and Migrant Ministry. You know, the organization's been around for over 40 years. So maybe we could start with the mission and we can kind of go from there. But so can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, you're exactly right. We've been around for, I think it's going on 42 years at this point, or even 43, since we're now well into 2024. Basically, Rural and Migrant Ministry is a justice organization that advocates for the rights of rural and farm working families. Our mission is that we work for the creation of a just rural New York state through nurturing leadership, changing unjust systems and structures, and standing with the disenfranchised, especially farm workers and rural workers.
And we talk a lot on this program about systemic inequality. Whether that's institutions, governments, even private companies sort of being built on inequality. But what about in an agricultural farm work setting? Can you maybe help elucidate how that disparity kind of plays out when it comes to farm work and how it impacts the farm workers?
Well, it impacts farm workers and thus the rest of all of us in a number of ways, right? So farm workers largely are seasonal workers. So many of them are migrant. They're basically coming from Mexico and Central America. And they're coming on what's known as an H-2A visa, which is temporary seasonal work. So they're not given the same rights, or at least they had not been up until the passage in 2019 of the Farm Laborers Fair Labor Practices Act. And what happened basically before that law was passed was that farm workers could basically be worked to death, right? They earned no overtime except after 60 or even 70 hours of work. They worked 7 days a week in the fields under pretty grueling conditions. They had no day of rest. And most importantly was that they had no right to bargain collectively. So they were basically forced to endure these conditions. And one of the conditions of the H-2A visa also is that they have to return to the same farm so that they could really get sucked in for years and years into very poor working conditions and have absolutely no recourse. So this created, a real systemic inequality in terms of labor rights. Now, in 2019, the Farm Laborers Fair Labor Practices Act was passed. And what this did, and this was after, Patrick, decades of marches and vigils and endless lobbying and sacrifice on the part of everyone involved. But that law ensured that farm workers, for the first time in New York history, are given the right to bargain collectively without any fear of punishment or reprisal, gives them the right to overtime pay after 40 hours, although this provision is currently being phased in over several years, and it gives them a day of rest.
And those are all things that we just consider to be, fair and healthy and just working conditions.
These are things that the rest of us take for granted. And yet these are things that, really, since the dawn of agricultural work in New York State, these workers were never given these rights. Let's not forget, too, that agricultural work is basically rooted in the system of slavery.
Right. And so you mentioned that the Farm Laborers Fair Labor Practices Act, or the FLFLPA, So yeah, you mentioned this after decades of marching, of fighting, this act finally passes in 2019, and essentially it guarantees certain conditions, as we just talked about. But then there was a temporary restraining order that essentially froze that law, and then farm workers were prevented from being able to organize. Right, that was kind of what the case was up until very recently.
Yeah. So, well, what happened was that a lawsuit was filed in federal court, right? This was filed in the U.S. District Court in Buffalo. And so this was a federal lawsuit that was filed by the New York State Vegetable Growers Association, along with 5 individual farms, and 2 of these farms are in Western New York, right? One in Albion, right near Buffalo, and the other in Wolcott in eastern Wayne County. And what they did was to have put in place a temporary restraining order that essentially froze the FLF-LPA while the case was going on. So this was basically intended as a union busting lawsuit.
Okay. And so that obviously, when that does happen, that puts these unionization efforts on hold. But obviously those talks have resumed since then, because Western District Court Judge John Sinatra Jr. lifted all but one piece of that restraining order just last month in February. So essentially farm workers now can resume organizing, right?
Yes, that is so. Although the case is not over, I will tell you that, because he lifted all but one piece of that temporary restraining order, but the piece that he left was the part that said the farmers had argued that their right to free speech was being infringed upon by not being able to essentially hold their farm workers as a captured audience and tell them about how terrible unionizing is for their farms, for the farmers for the farm workers themselves, and for their families. That was the piece that Judge Sinatra did not lift in the temporary restraining order. So the reason that that's disconcerting is because the farm workers typically live on the farms where they work. And so they have no easy avenue of escaping these kinds of pressures that are being placed on them by the farmers, who are, just kind of browbeating them into not organizing, not bargaining collectively.
Mm-hmm. And I would love to hear a little bit more about maybe some of these conditions that a lot of farm workers and rural workers live in. So many of them live right at the farm. Is there kind of other details and maybe a picture, not trying to paint with a broad brush, but just to give some insight into what conditions might be common for folks who are farm workers? What kind of situations have a lot of these folks found themselves in?
So a lot of the farm work housing is pretty shoddy and shabby. A lot of them don't even have basic things like television or any kind of, cable or anything, so that they have any sort of relaxation and respite in their few off hours of the heavy labor of farm work. A lot of them are glorified trailers that are often falling apart with substandard plumbing. And some of them are sleeping on cots and basically chairs, like reclining chairs. So this is not the Holiday Inn by any extent.
And, we're speaking not long after there was a talk here in Buffalo put on in part by the Western New York Peace Center. It was titled Solidarity with Farm Workers in Western New York. You sort of talked about this as well, but there's obviously no shortage of farms in Western New York. So I imagine top of mind in the realm of thinking about what is just and helping, helping on a road toward equity, very basic level, we're talking safety, we're talking fair pay for fair work. I mean, those are the big issues?
Absolutely. And safety is a big issue. oftentimes when there's an accident or when there's a safety situation, by the time OSHA gets involved, right? By the time they get involved, it's often too late. And the other thing too is that depending on the type of farming that's going on, some of that work is extremely dangerous. The New York Times has written about it, so have other major newspapers across the country, that the conditions are often pretty deplorable.
Some quick numbers just from New York State. So nearly 23% of the state's total land area is in agricultural use. In some counties in the Finger Lakes in Western New York and down in the southern tier, farmland comprises more than 40% of the total land area. So kind of to that end, we're talking about a significant economic impact, obviously not just on New York State, but on a national level and perhaps international. As such, farm workers, they wield a great deal of power as the laborers. Now, there's this idea of accompaniment, which is a big part of Rural and Migrant Ministry. Folks who are impacted by decisions need to be at the table when those decisions are made. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and that's basically what's at the heart of collective bargaining, right? Is having a voice, having a seat at the table where decisions that affect farm workers are being made. And what RMM does is to basically, our whole 20-year campaign, in the Justice for Farm Workers campaign, which was seeing to fruition the FLF-LPA, was probably the best example of accompaniment that our organization has, right? Because we stood with these really embattled farm workers and their families all the way from essentially abject misery to turning the corner and finally seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. Now, that said, there's always going to be pushback, right? Anytime there's progress made, there are always going to be opposing forces that are going to try to move the needle backwards again. Mm-hmm. And so our work in accompaniment is by far not over. And so that means that we show up to court for these hearings, in this lawsuit, in every lawsuit. We recently had a case of a farm worker who did not speak English, was wrongly accused, and I do stress that, wrongly accused of shoplifting at a Walmart store in Wayne County. And we were with her. The charges were dropped because, again, it was an unjust accusation. But really, without RMM standing with folks, they might not have anyone else to stand with them.
Mm. What about for folks who perhaps are listening to this or just kind of follow certain headlines and they're interested in showing solidarity? How can folks do that? Just some basic things that folks can do to help.
Well, at a very basic level, just doing things like writing letters to the editor of your local paper, right? Submitting a guest op-ed to your local paper, writing to your legislators, whether they're local, statewide, national. The point is to make your voice heard. And in making your voice heard in support of farm workers, you're helping farm workers make their voices heard. The other thing is that we would love for you to join us at RMM and be part of our campaign. And so one of the best way that you can do that is to go to our website, ruralmigrantministry.org, and look at all the ways that there are to volunteer and help. And of course, financial contributions are always welcome because unfortunately, none of this comes for free. Right. And we are a nonprofit. Right. So we always appreciate financial support from folks who are able to help out. And I will say that whether it's a $5 gift or a $500 donation to RMM, it all adds up and it all goes directly into supporting farm workers and rural workers and their families.
Okay. Well, I think those are some good actionable steps there. Gittel Evangelist is the communications coordinator for Rural and Migrant Ministry. She joins us here on What's Next for this conversation about farm workers and their fight for better conditions. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for having me. And we stay strong in solidarity.